Good evening, everyone. My name is Lindy Cameron, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you all to the library's special Wine and Crime event for this evening. The Geelong Library Corporation acknowledges the Waddi and Eastern Maar original owners of the lands on which the library services operate. And tonight we pay respect to the Waddi and Eastern Maar elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and celebrate First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. And story is what we're all about tonight. I'll just say welcome to Katherine and Kerry. Just say hi, ladies.
Hi.
Just make sure your sound's working. Thank you. Now, a few housekeeping reminders for those of you who are watching. You can participate in the live webinar that we're doing by clicking on the Q&A button and typing your question or comment. If you're using an iPad or something like that, you might need to just touch your screen to get it going. And this webinar is recorded as well. So if you'd like to watch the discussion again afterwards or share it with family and friends because we've been so fabulously entertaining that you'll want to do that, then it will be uploaded to the library in the next couple of days. So tonight, I have the great pleasure of introducing two fabulous crime writers, but I will begin by telling you who I am. I am a writer of both crime fact and fiction. I am the publisher of Clandestine Press, a founding member and current president of Sisters in Crime Australia. And tonight I have the pleasure of introducing you all to one crime writer who has her 9th book under her belt and another who is a debut author. So first of all, top left, if your screens look the same as mine, wave Kerry. We have Kerry McGinnis, who is an outback and rural mystery crime writer. She's the author of 9 books, which include the Waddi Tree, Out of Alice, the Heartwood Hotel and the Roadhouse. And Kerry is joining us tonight from Bundaberg to talk about her latest release, which is Croc Country. Welcome, Kerry.
Thank you, Linda. And,
we also have Katherine Firkin. Now, Katherine is a Melbourne journalist who currently, or rather under normal circumstances, actually works with CBS in New York. But her crime novel, debut crime novel, Sticks and Stones, is a page-turning police procedural set in the heart of Melbourne. And Katherine joins us tonight from COVID lockdown in Melbourne. I'm sure you'd rather be in New York at the moment. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Nice to be here.
Okay, we'll get right down to some good sort of criminal type questions. First of all, I'd like you both to give sort of an elevator pitch for your books. Katherine, on a very basic level, Sticks and Stones is a police procedural, but in a nutshell, what is it about?
Yeah, so it is a crime thriller and a police procedural, which is set in Melbourne, and it follows my lead detective, Emmett Corbin. He's head of the Missing Persons Unit. And when we first meet him, he's really feeling a little bit unimpressed with the role he's taken on. He's finding that the unit is really quite under-resourced and understaffed, and he's really left swamped with these quite banal cases, which he thinks local stations should be handling themselves. But then he comes across this case of a missing mum, and this is really when everything changes for Emmett. He finds out this mum left her 2 children at a holiday program, and she never returned to pick them up. So it does immediately look extremely suspicious, and we really see Emmett go from one end of the scale to the other, from being quite bored and feeling like he's made a bit of a mistake to take on this new role, to effectively chasing this really dangerous predator through the streets of Melbourne.
Great pitch. I'd buy it if I'd heard that. Now our Kerry, up there in fabulous Bundaberg, the title of your new book, Croc Country, it tells us all sorts of things, but what is it actually about?
Croc Country is about my protagonist, excuse me, Tilly, who has suffered a tragedy in her own life and sort of withdrawn to the furthest she can get in the outback to start a new life altogether on a ranger station on what used to be a cattle station, and where she's cook and housekeeper for the rangers that run the sanctuary. And while she's trying to put her life together again and get over her tragic loss, she becomes embroiled in, through no fault of her own, in mysterious circumstances on the sanctuary, and meets a man who is an undercover agent to find out what's going on, there to find out what's going on, and falls for him in the process of helping him solve the mystery of what is going on.
And there's quite a few mysteries going on, actually, isn't there? So we'll get to that in a second. Now, I'd like to begin by noting that on a superficial level, these two books couldn't be more different. They really couldn't. Kerry, your Croc Country is set, as you just said, in the far outback of Australia's northwestern Gulf country. Just from the fabulous descriptions of the scenery and the wilderness out there, I really want to go. It might be one of my first trips when we're allowed to go anywhere ever again. But as you said, a young widow has retreated there to the Binboona Wildlife Sanctuary to help her cousin and a couple of rangers run at the campsite there. And even at the height of the season, there aren't that many people traipsing around this isolated wilderness, certainly not all at once. On the other hand, Katherine, your novel is set at the other end of mainland Australia in the crowded and busy streets of Melbourne in winter. And your novel has a huge cast of characters, which of course means there's also a huge suspect pool for your main character, Emmett, to fish around in to find out, you know, who's committing the dastardly deeds, and they are quite dastardly. So apart from the whole notion of writing what you know, given where you both live, Melbourne and far north Queensland, is there a stronger reason why you chose those two settings for these books? I'll start with you, Kerry. Why the Gulf country this time? I know your books have been set all over the northern Queensland.
Well, I lived in the Gulf country for 40 years, not precisely where this novel is set, but I did take a trip through the area I was writing about just to check on the flora and fauna and what the country looked like, because I like to be very realistic in my settings. And I write about bush because the bush is what I know, and you can't really have a bigger cast of characters than I have because it just doesn't happen. I like to stick to what is possible and what is probable. And I also like to explore, usually into family relationships, but in this case, they are a little family anyway, more deeply than I sort of explore the crime, as it were. The crime is sort of incidental to the build-up of the characters and what type of people they are and how their lives are lived.
Yeah, that's very true. The mystery in Croc Country sort of weaves its way, a bit like an underground river almost. It weaves its way under the general story. What about you, Katherine? I mean, obviously you've been living in New York at one stage or other, and you're about to head back there in October, I believe, when you're allowed to. So you've obviously lived in places other than Melbourne. Why set your first crime novel in the most livable city in the world?
Supposedly. My novel sort of does rely a lot on my background as a journalist. So I've been working in the media for about 13 years. Most of that has been covering crime, a lot of criminal activity, and also a lot of court reporting. And most of that was done in Melbourne. So I really feel really comfortable and really quite confident that I know Victoria's legal system. I know the court system. I really did feel almost like I'd covered these crimes, to be honest. I felt like I knew all the characters and I knew exactly how I wanted my book to feel. And I did want it to be gritty. I did want it to be quite urban. I have to admit, being my first book, I was really nervous setting it in the city, because right now, if you look at Australian crime, most of the really successful authors are setting it in the outback or by the beach or somewhere quite rural. And I was worried, is there something I don't know? Am I being really, foolish? What am I doing? But I really wanted to. And I guess I just trusted my gut that the vision I had for the book was that it was in the laneways and by the docks and all the stuff that makes Melbourne great, and also a little bit gritty.
Yeah, the mean streets, as we call them. Yes, there's so much rural mysteries coming out at the moment. It's like everyone's jumping on Kerry's bandwagon and leaving the city in droves, sort of having their own tree change in fiction as well as fact. So I'm gathering a sense of place, a strong sense of place is always very, very important in any crime novel, and you've both mastered that extraordinarily well. As I said, I want to go to the Gulf country now, and I could almost navigate the streets of Melbourne using your book, Katherine, and I think that's a fine thing when you can do that. How important, obviously, using Melbourne was important to you, and the landscape of your books are really important to you. Do you regard them as characters, in a sense, as an extra character in your stories, or is it more than that? Kerry?
Yes, I think you could say they are an extra character, because in a lot of my books, they curtail what people can do, because if you're living in the bush in isolation, everything depends upon the weather. So if you want to stop them getting to a place that's vital they get to, all you need is a decent downpour or a dust storm or a fire or something. So in a way,
even a tree down, in a sense, a tree across the road can hold things up.
You just drive around it, get the chance to cut it up. Come on, you've got to be a bit handy. No, it is quite important, and it also sort of helps to put the character on their mettle. I mean, they're isolated. They've got to figure things out for themselves. They can't just stick their head next door and say, I need a hand. You've got to work on it yourself, which, and because I tend to like strong female characters, it gives an opportunity to showcase that. I really don't do fluttery little, oh, poor little me, come and
thank goodness.
So I just draw on the bushwomen that I've known, the sort of people I've known. To get
people like you, I'm guessing, actually, Kerry, given the jobs that you've had up there in Queensland over the years.
Yes, well, being girly and frippery doesn't get you anywhere.
No, not useful at all. I can't imagine you suffering those sorts of women. Katherine, what about you with the streets of Melbourne? I mean, as I said, you could almost navigate the northern and western suburbs and St Kilda through the travelling that your characters are doing. Is it as a character for you too? Did you want to sort of bring Melbourne to your fans in New York, perhaps? Who knows?
Melbourne actually took over more than I was expecting. When I really first sat down and did it, I wanted the crimes to really drive this book and the backstory of my characters and who they were. And I wanted people to feel that sense of, I've just got to see what happens next. So I must admit, the setting initially didn't feel as important. But, this is my first book and I'm kind of learning as I go. And it's interesting hearing Kerry talk about how important her setting is. And I was really surprised by how important Melbourne became to this book, and how it did, exactly as Kerry said, it actually affected what my characters could do and where they could be and how they feel as well. Because when it's drizzly and it's cold in Melbourne and you're stuck in the docklands and you're on the wrong angle and the wind's just whipping you in the face, that does affect how you feel, as opposed to, all the other great aspects of Melbourne. So it really does drive the book. And I was really surprised how much of a character it became on its own.
That's fabulous, because you're affected in Melbourne by things like the weather. I mean, our fabulous weather, 4 seasons in one day. And yeah, so it's great. It's great to see. I love reading a new how a new crime writer or a new writer sees the city that I've lived in for most of my life too. And it's fabulous to see how you look at the streets and the different suburbs, and which ones that you chose. Is it, did you choose those suburbs for a particular reason? Is that your old stomping ground, or you just thought?
Yeah, I did choose areas that I've either sort of really had a connection to, and I felt very much that I knew them extremely well, or I have to admit I got a lot of help from different members of Victoria Police writing this book. And one of the particular officers I got a very close contact with and actually became quite good friends, she had worked extensively around the Flemington Commission flats and doing a lot of sort of work with kids and trying to really sort of help integration and things like that. And she was fabulous. And the story she told me, it really brought that alive for me. And I wanted to sort of pass that across. So it was a combination of what I felt I knew really well, and also, I guess, other influences like some of the police that I used for help.
Yeah. Well, we'll go to a research question, seeing that you've actually brought it up. So, Kerry, you were talking about how you went out into the Gulf country again to make sure that things were as you remembered them, and to sort of, you know, get your own look at the flora and fauna, which plays a huge part in your story, of course, because your main character Tilly is you know, doing the housekeeping and cooking at the beginning of the book for a bunch of rangers. So the work that they're doing out there is very, very important. Did you spend time at a sanctuary like the one that you've created? Did you spend much time with rangers, or were you winging it? Did you know how much is research and how much is wishful thinking, like we often do with writing?
No, I didn't. I mean, I do know rangers. I've known them in the past because the family property was just north of Lawn Hill National Park. I don't know if you've heard of that. Up in the Gulf, there's the Lawn Hill Gorge. It's very famous and a great draw for tourism. So I've known the rangers there, but just casually. I didn't sort of do any research on it. The only thing I researched was the bats, because I really don't know much about bats, and I wanted to get it right.
Right.
So the area that I set it in, they do have caves there that are astonishingly, extraordinarily hot. The hills just seem to hold the heat. You go in there and it's about 39 degrees.
Yeah, I found that quite extraordinary, to think that, you know, in a cold, sort of dank cave, that where you would assume that it would be sort of musty and cold and damp, that it was actually hot. That's intriguing.
But I assure you that is a fact.
Yeah.
So the caves were there, and I thought, well, I may as well, I mean, they were there in the real locality. I thought I may as well make use of them. So I had to go looking for something to put in the caves, and I thought, oh, well, why not bats? I'll have a look at bats. I found out that there were some very unique bats, so I thought, well, I would use that. But the rest of it was just from my own knowledge of what goes on. And I mean, you spend your life in the bush with on a property, you do learn a lot about the native flora and fauna without even knowing you're doing it. So
Of course,
just
yeah.
Common sense. I have raised an awful lot of orphan animals in my time.
I bet you have. which is a lovely sort of part of what Tilly's doing as well. The sugar glider that she helps care for, and the birds that come. The what's his name? The
Brolga.
The Brolga with the broken beak. I can't remember his name.
Harry.
Harry, that's right. I was going to say Bruce for some reason. Yeah. So it's wonderful to see that the characters in there are you know, sort of they enjoy what they're doing. So with you, Katherine, obviously you had a police contact, which helped because you've got you've got quite a few police in there that are going off on not just Emmett, I mean, who go off and do part of the job of investigating what's going on for these terrible crimes in Melbourne. So did you sort of take the advice of the one cop that is now a friend of yours and sort of extrapolate across, you know, female cops, male cops, and do that, or did you just sort of use the research and just create your own characters?
No, it was interesting. I think I was a bit naive when I started, maybe even a bit arrogant. You know, I thought because I'm a journo and I worked in crime and courts for about 13 years, I thought I know it all, I'll be fine. As soon as I got going, it was amazing how much I didn't know about the actual police methodology and procedure. And because I did want this to be realistic, it was amazing how much research I actually had to go and do. So that one female constable I was mentioning, she sort of helped me with the uniform aspect of it. But I then went and also got a few other detectives, male and female, because I think that is interesting, the different perspectives on things. I ended up getting quite a cast of different detectives to help me. One of them in particular has been involved in pretty much every major Victorian high-profile crime you can think of. So I was very lucky to get some really very, very experienced help. I went as far as actually sending them bits of my manuscript and sort of saying, is this working? Does this work? You know, I did take liberties. It's not non-fiction, but I really wanted it to be realistic. And it was always so crushing when I got that email back going, nah. It was like, oh, then I have to go back and rewrite. And because of the nature of my book, it's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. There's threads going everywhere. The moment I changed one thing, it stuffed up everything else.
Of course. Yeah. In Sisters in Crime these days, we call that the CSI effect. You know, we're so accustomed to seeing a crime solved within an hour and DNA testing done and dusted within the first 20 minutes that we assume that it's got to be, you know, almost that quick, and it really isn't. So yeah, so you do have to get the absolute basics right in order to, you know, use the poetic license that we just love doing. I've got a question actually has already come up from Lillian. Lillian would like, as this has a question for Katherine, did you have any difficulties writing a male protagonist? She says she's trying to write one herself and she's a bit paranoid about how she's doing.
It's an interesting question. No, I have to admit, I really felt, I mean, my story is told from quite a few different perspectives. You probably haven't had a chance to read it yet, but so I have got female perspectives. I've also got young child perspectives, and I've got a few different men in there. I have to admit, I didn't have trouble jumping into Emmett's head. I also didn't have too much trouble jumping into the killer's head. I think the key is though, and I don't know obviously with your own manuscript, but I do think the key is to make sure that your characters are very distinct. I don't know if it matters so much, are they male or are they female, because we all have similar emotions, no matter how we process them or how we might display them. But I think, you know, just talking for myself, one thing I was really aware of was making sure I didn't blend too much across my different characters so that they did stay distinct, if that makes sense. So, you know, I not knowing too much about the manuscript, I think have confidence that you absolutely can write from a male perspective, because, you know, I'm sure there are men who think and feel very similar to the way you do. But if you're doing more perspectives like I did, just be careful that you are very much isolating the characters. Certainly, I had to do a fair bit of rewriting when I realised a few of my characters had similar expressions, and I was like, oh, hang on. I need to keep them different people.
Yeah, that was actually another point of difference I was going to bring up between your two books, because Croc Country, Kerry's book, is all from the point of view of one person, and that's Tilly. We meet all of the other characters, male and female, and they're all wonderfully fleshed out, all of these characters, but we see them all from her perspective. So the only thoughts that we share in the reading of it is hers and what's happening to her and how she's feeling and how she sees these other people. But it doesn't diminish the fact that these other characters are quite real and solid and believable. Whereas you, Katherine, as you've just said, you're not, I wouldn't call it head hopping, because that's actually something that happens, you know, in one scene where you don't know who's talking. You've managed to do it very, very well, even though at once you do have, for instance, Emmett, one of the other characters whose point of view you give is his wife. And so that does present the fact of, you know, if they're in a scene together, whose head are you going to be in? So the decision then has to be made, well, you know, whose point of view is this scene from? So I'll start with you, Kerry. Because everything is from Tilly's point of view, is that something that you normally do? Do you just normally stick to one point of view in your stories normally, or is it just sort of the way that Croc Country turned out that it was the best thing to do?
I don't always stick to the one character. Sometimes in some of my earlier books two of my earlier books I had male protagonists, because at the time I wasn't confident about writing women, and I thought, well, I know men terribly well because I've lived all my life with men, worked with men, and I thought, well, that's easy. And I was really heartened when a man friend of mine read the book, and he said, there's only one thing that puzzles me. And he said, and it's a bit scary. And I said, what's that, Bill? And he said, how the hell do you know so much about men? So I was really thrilled. But no, it just seemed to suit the story. But others, some of my other books, I have them told through one set of eyes, and then others I have various points of view from various characters. It just depends what seems to work best.
Right. You didn't think to tell your friend that men are quite easy to read, did you?
I didn't want to hurt his feelings. You have to keep them along.
So Katherine, with you could have done the same thing in a sense. You could have just, you know, told the story from Emmett's point of view, the crime as it unfolded, and although that you do have the character of the young child's point of view, which is very important to the story. And in a lot of sort of police procedural type stories like that, you might just have that one central character and that other voice. But as you said, we've got Emmett's wife. We've got at least one of the other police officers who's also a bit bored with what he's been given to do and jealous of one of the other cops who keeps, you know, getting the jobs that are more fun. But also another character who, you know, gets herself into diabolical trouble because she's, you know, just I wanted to slap her, honestly. I wanted to slap her because, you know, don't fall in love with the bloke that you work with, for goodness sake, woman. He doesn't mean what he's saying. So was that a conscious choice for you to tell it from their points of view as well, or rather than to use the one step back of just telling the story? Or did it just happen? It just evolved?
It did sort of just evolve. But, you know, the thing that I loved about writing from different perspectives for this style of book that I was doing, because it was so much about the characters and it is a bit of a whodunit, I sort of found it very interesting to show people from everyone else's perspective or from one person's perspective, and then get in their head and for people to realize that they see themselves as a whole different person. Because it's something that I find really fascinating is the sort of the way we present to the world, how we think people see us, and then what they're actually thinking when they look at us. And also how much of our viewpoint is influenced by our own experiences. And I think that's really fascinating. You know, this woman you're talking about, Abby, who's infuriating in one way, and I agree with you, and I've met plenty of Abbys, and I've probably been an Abby in some ways.
Oh, no, I hope not.
No, not to the extreme. But I've done dumb things and made mistakes, and I'm sure people looking back will think how stupid. But when you're inside her head, you realise that she's really only able to process things with the information she has, with the education she has, with everything else that's gone on in her life. And that's something I find really interesting. Like I do feel, you mentioned I've got a little child in there. He comes from quite a traumatized background, and you see him trying to process things. One thing I do find is that it's easy to sort of stand back and point at people and say, well, you should have behaved differently. But if you don't have the tools in the toolbox, you can't necessarily do better. And I think that's one thing I loved about showing people from afar and then jumping in their head. It was sort of fun.
It works really well. And the instance that I gave before is actually Emmett and his wife. You know, he's dealing with this massive crime that he's investigating, and at the same time he's fully aware that he's not home enough for his wife and child, and she's just got a new job, so she's looking at their marriage from a whole whole different point of view as well. And the voice of the traumatized kid is just, it's a fabulous voice. And I doubt that could have been envisaged as well if it had been told from a third person point of view or anything. I mean, it works so well. You're right there with him, and you feel so sorry for him. That's another thing that's similar between your two books, though, is that sense of family. And you touched on that a bit before, Kerry, how Tilly goes to the wildlife sanctuary up there as an escape from the tragedy in her own life. And she goes to help her cousin, but what she finds there is the found family, the rangers who work there, and the fact that they come to feel like a family. But the tragedy is in her own family and the things that she has to come and deal with. So, and of course, Katherine, you've got the sort of the marriage, the good marriage, but you know, things go a little awry at one stage because of the misunderstandings or whatever. So both of your books are surprisingly about family as well. How dark secrets can affect, you know, the things that are happening now, and all of the different sorts of families that there are. Were you conscious of that? Obviously, I think you were, Kerry, because you actually mentioned it. Were you conscious of doing that, Katherine, as well, the various family lives?
No, I actually read a blog post about my book, and it was how clever I was to play on families. And I thought, oh, and it was like, did I do that? And then I realized, well, yeah, I've got the marriage and the small family with Emmett and Cindy and their little kid, and then I've got the young boy who can't really find himself a family, and then I've got another woman who's desperately wanting a family. But it wasn't something that I deliberately did. But I think when I look back now, it is because, you know, I did want my characters to be very whole and very real. And I do think it's something that affects us so much. You know, there's always that sort of meme that goes around, you know, raise your hand if you've come from a normal family, and no one does. You know, there's always some, you know, I don't know, not trauma, but there's also always some family tension, and it can be your greatest source of support and your identity in some ways. It can also be your downfall, depending what's happened or how you've grown up. So I do think it's fascinating. I have to be honest, though, and say it's sort of just happened by accident.
It probably wasn't. It was probably filtering through your brain and all the little jigsaw pieces, you know, fitting together. And I mean, the fact that these two books, which are, you know, as I said, on the surface, so completely and utterly different, and yet, you know, the thing that I noticed about them most was the fact that they are both about family, which I mean, you could say that about a lot of books, but then I've read a lot of crime novels that are, especially police procedurals, that don't take in the notion of family so much. So it's quite interesting. I think there's something in the water. We've got a couple of other questions from people. So we'll go on to sorts of things about your writing process, perhaps. So we've touched a bit on research. Do you know the plotter and pantser phrase, Katherine? Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that Kerry does, because I think she was asked that just recently. So are you a plotter or a pantser, Kerry?
Me, both, I think. And I just depend a lot on things coming to me. When I start a book, I always know the beginning and I always know the end, and I have no idea what's going to happen in the middle. But if I could just keep writing, I just keep getting ideas, and some of them work and some of them don't. So you just toss them out and go back and get another idea and keep going.
And so are you constantly moving towards the end that you wanted, or just sometimes you just have to, you know, chuck out the ending that you originally had and just go with the flow?
No, I stick with the ending because I worked that out first.
That's great. That's great.
It's just a matter of filling up the middle.
Yeah.
I remember I wrote they wanted an outline at Penguin once when I mentioned I was starting a new book, and she said, "Oh, great, send me an outline." And I said, "This is going to happen in the middle, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen in the beginning." And where it's set, and this is the time frame, and this is where it'll end, and I have no idea what happens in the middle, but I'm sure I'll think of something.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think publishers and even editors realise sometimes that actually writing the synopsis is harder than writing the book.
Yes, absolutely.
And so if you haven't written the book yet, it's almost impossible to do unless you are a complete plotter. What about you, Katherine? Did you have yours mapped out, or did it also just, spread itself out willy-nilly?
I'm so happy to hear Kerry say this, because I've been feeling like a bit of a fraud, because I'm exactly the same as her. At least for the first one, I had a really strong idea of my start and how I wanted it to open and my characters, and I knew exactly the ending I wanted. I had the last scene written. I knew where I was going. I had no idea how I was going to get there. And I sort of just trusted my characters to sort of lead the way through. And I like writing my way through things. It's how I think naturally anyway. So I sort of just let my characters take me, and 99% of the time it works itself out. The few times you get that little inkling where you're like, I don't love this, that's when you do need to just throw it out the window and start again. But yeah, I'm actually really relieved to hear Kerry say this, because she's such a great writer, and to hear her say that makes me feel better, because I was feeling like a fraud, because I met the people at Penguin and they said, they were sort of talking similarly, like, so how much have you worked out, and you must have a detailed structure because your book's so complicated.
Yeah, well, you're not alone. Most of the writers, in fact, most of the crime writers that I know are more of the pantsing variety, like you two. I'm a bit of a mix of both, mostly a pantser. I don't know if you know Solari Gentle's writing, but she doesn't even know who the murderer is until almost her main character works out who it is. So there's that. She starts with an idea and then just goes for it. So did you know who the murderer was all the time, or the whole time, and the bad guy? Did you know that as well, Kerry?
I changed my mind halfway through.
Oh, did you?
Yes.
What about you, Katherine?
Oh yeah,
You knew who it was?
Yeah, I had my killer, I had my little child, I had everything, that sort of area lined up. I just, after about chapter 3, I was on my own, just completely letting them do their thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. So we've got another question from Charlotte. Charlotte says, hello, Lindy, Katherine and Kerry. Hello, Charlotte. Charlotte wants to know if either of you or both of you have any advice for aspiring writers of crime fiction.
Oh.
Good question, Charlotte. Maybe not. Well, any advice for writers full stop, put it that way.
Oh yes, write every day, write something every day, even if you throw it out the next day. But I mean, as for advice on crime, I suppose if you set it in a city, you've got more opportunity for more crimes, because there are comparatively few crimes that you can carry out in the outback. Really, somebody said to me the other day, well, you could always have them rustling cattle, and you can't. You're losing half your characters immediately. You've got a bunch of cattle, you've got to have 3 or 4 of your characters looking after them. Well, I really have more than 6, so there's the story gone immediately. There aren't any banks to rob. You can't do, not in the period of time, because I don't write anything further forward than the early 90s. You can't do embezzlement or white-collar fraud or anything like that, because the internet doesn't work or isn't existing. So, you're stuck with murder and drugs and smuggling and things like that. It's so, if you really want to get into crime, you set it in a town where there's plenty of baddies around and plenty of opportunity.
That's what I know. I realised like about 3/4 of the way through Croc Country. I think when I started reading it, I knew it was set in the 90s or thereabouts, but then I forgot, because it doesn't really, the story just sweeps you along, so it doesn't really matter when it was set. And until there was a couple of instances, I'm thinking to myself, why don't they use a mobile phone? Why don't they have and then I thought, oh, maybe they don't have mobile phone towers out there. And then I'm thinking, why is he sending a film off to have the film process? You know, why isn't he using his iPhone? And then I'm thinking, oh, that's right, it's set sometime in the 90s. What's the reason for that? Why do you just not like modern technology?
I don't understand modern technology well enough to write about it with confidence. Half the things my computer does, I have no idea of. I don't own a smartphone and I hate modems, so it's very difficult for me to sort of, and I would never remember that you can pull out your phone and do it. I mean, I've got a phone and I look at it once a week, just a little ordinary prepaid. And when I remember, which is on the way to the gym on Friday morning, for some reason, as I get out of the car, I think, oh, the phone. I pull it out and see if anybody's rung me. But I just don't think about it because I lived most of my life without any sort of phone. And that's for one that you can carry around with you. Now, I've only got it so that when I break down, I can ring RACQ.
Oh, good. And well, hopefully you just remember to keep it charged, because otherwise it'll be as useful as a notepad.
Oh, I rush home from the gym and stick it on the charger.
That's funny. I can remember getting to about J in J is for Justice in Sue Grafton's books, and I hadn't read one for like about 3 years, and I'm reading it and I'm thinking, why does she keep getting out of the car and using a telephone box? And why is she writing everything on index cards? And then I realised that all of her novels, all the way up to Y is for whatever the last letter was, I can't remember now, was still set in the, you know, in the 80s, and I'd forgotten that every single one of her novels was still set back then.
Well, it's a bit like the weather, you know, it curtails the possibilities and makes it harder. If you can't just instantly whip up the police or the ambulance or help or whatever, if you've got to drive around or run around to find a phone box, I think it makes life more interesting.
Yes, and also you won't have to come across the thing that maybe Katherine might have to now if she writes a sequel to Sticks and Stones, and that is take into account a pandemic that keeps everyone at home. So, you know, so many people have been, other writers I know have been asking the question, are you planning on, you know, including the pandemic in your next crime novel or your next whatever? And everyone's going, no, I think I'll just set everything in 2019. And it will be perpetually 2019 until we're over this and can see how it works.
Yes, if it runs for 5 years, that'll be a bit awkward, won't it?
Yeah, it will be, won't it? We'll just do what you're doing, just stick to 2019 or earlier. So, Katherine, same question to you about writing. What was the question? Writing process. What's your advice? That's it. What's your advice for writers?
Right. Yeah, I think she was asking about, you know, advice for crime writers, and I think, you know, there's so many different styles of crime writing. You know, even just talking to me and Kerry, they're completely different books. But not knowing exactly what you're working on, one of my tips would be if you're doing something similar to mine, where you're doing something, you know, like a police procedural, or just something where you do need to know a little bit the ins and outs of an actual case, absolutely go and sit in a courtroom. Obviously right now we can't because of pandemic, but in normal times, it's absolutely open to the general public. And you'll learn so much just picking a case and sitting there and watching things and just taking notes, even if it's just on character development and seeing what an offender looks like and how the murderer acts in the dock and what the victim's family are like, and hearing the victim impact statements and all those type of things. That certainly really shaped for me a lot of what I was doing. And I think that's a really good tip if you're doing something similar to what I've done. The other thing I would say is don't be afraid to ask for help. You know, just because I'm a journo doesn't give me some kind of, you know, magic on approaching police. You know, there's nothing wrong with you, you know, walking up. I mean, I literally at some stages was just walking up to police officers and asking them, hey, how would you do this? What would you do in this case? You know, sometimes they're friendly, sometimes they're not. But
sometimes they wonder if you're going to rob a bank and just want them to be out of the way.
But, you know, don't be afraid to actually just, you know, if that's the kind of information you need, don't be afraid to just approach people, because eventually you will find people who are happy to help. And if you're looking for police, you know, former detectives and former cops are absolute gold, because they will tend to blab a little bit more and they'll be a little bit more relaxed. And, you know, a little chat around, you know, if you've got a parent group or something, you can usually find someone whose brother's friend's sister is a cop or is a detective. And that kind of information can be really useful.
Yeah, and you never know who can help. I was talking to a fellow writer at a Christmas drinks once, and I was telling her what I was writing at the time, and telling her I'd just been researching Apache helicopters, and then, you know, I was writing it from a certain perspective of a bloke who was a mechanic, and she said, my brother is a pilot of Black Hawk helicopters, if you'd like to talk to a man to know what a man thinks of a you know, a piece of equipment like that. And it was just perfect timing, because, you know, I got to speak to this guy, and what we were saying before about guys who are easy to read, I had created, he virtually said what I had given to the character, my imaginary character anyway. So it was nice to know that how I thought a bloke would think about a fabulous throbbing Apache helicopter was kind of pretty similar to what they think about a car or a motorbike, so just bigger. So that was fun. So and I've discovered one of the things about being a member of Sisters in Crime, well, you don't even have to be a member, although it's a bonus if you're a writer to be a member of Sisters in Crime, because a good proportion of our membership are people in the professions that we crime writers need to talk to. You know, our membership includes judges and lawyers and cops and forensic pathologists and scientists who specialize in bugs and or bullets or whatever it might be. And so if you're any writers out there and you're wanting to be writing crime and have access to the sorts of people that we know, I recommend that you join Sisters in Crime, and you know, it'll open your world like nothing else will. We've got another question from Wendy Rankin. Brilliant name, Rankin. You know, can't have a better crime writing name than that. Wendy wants to know how you both went about getting published, and if you had a lot of rejections before you were first picked up.
Yes, I could have papered the walls of a room with all the little slips they used to send out back in the 70s. The editor thanks you for your contribution and regrets it is not quite what I had in mind at present. Little tiny things like that. I could have put them all over the wall if I'd kept them all. And I got my first book published mainly because I used what was basically a short story. It had been written as a short story, but it became part of my first book, which was an autobiography called Pieces of Blue. And I sent it to Meanjin, where they had a competition. And the first prize was $1,500 in publication.
Oh, excellent.
Yes, I was so astonished. Of course, I couldn't get there because it was the middle of the cattle season and we were working and it was down in Melbourne. But anyway.
And there might have been rustlers.
Yes, you call them duffers, actually. Yes, that was the reason, basically, that I got my first book published. And
Katherine, rejection on rejection, or were you one of the lucky ones who wrote your first novel and had people bowing down before you?
Yeah, not quite bowing down. No, I tried to write a few manuscripts sort of in my late teens, early 20s, and they never saw the light of day because they were terrible. I didn't send them anywhere and show them to anyone, but 100% they would have got rejected if I had sent them out. I rejected them enough not to impose them on anybody. As for Sticks and Stones, it was my first crime manuscript that I've written. I actually was lucky. I got an agent very, very quickly. But then the process of getting a publisher was not so easy. I did get a lot of rejections. And it was really confusing for me, this process, because it was like night and day, the comments I was getting. You know, the first rejection was, it's way too gruesome, it's too grisly, it needs to be lighter. And then the next one was, it's too light, it needs to be darker. And it was quite literally that different. So I actually didn't know what to even do with any of it, to be honest. It was just all a bit disappointing. And then Bev, my publisher at Penguin, rang me, and she was just fantastic. She sort of gave me a bit of tough love and said how excited she was about the way I wrote and the style and everything. But she kind of said, look, your manuscript in the current form needs a lot of work. I'm prepared to work with you on it if you're prepared to do this, 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 and that. And we ended up basically rewriting it together twice. And I feel very lucky that I managed to find a publisher that was prepared to invest in me. I don't know if everyone is, because clearly my manuscript, when it went out, as much as I loved it, it probably wasn't quite 100%. And the book that's out there now is not the manuscript that I sent in. So you can be lucky and just find someone that believes in you. But that came after a lot of no. So.
Yeah, it's not unusual at all for manuscripts to have, you know, for a commissioning editor or a publisher, I've been there myself, to see the kernel that's in the story and to see the potential talent that the writer has, but know that it's not quite right. Maybe the sense of place is not quite there yet, or the characters aren't separate enough, which is what you were talking before about having to, because you had so many different points of view, you have to make sure that they are all in fact different. And I mean, sometimes it simply takes the editor to look at it and say, as you said before, you know, these three cops all talk the same. So, you know, and sometimes only someone else can see that. You might never see it, no matter how polished your manuscript is. So it is great when you've got someone who's willing to take you on in the hope that you will agree to, you know, to work with them on that basis. It's fabulous. So we have any more questions? We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. If any of the other participants out there in COVID land, lockdown land, anyone who's not in Melbourne, perhaps. Any other questions? No? Okay, so what's coming up? Oh, hang on, we've got another one. Lillian Gray, how do you both approach the research aspect of writing? Well, we touched on that a bit before, but how much, I'll rephrase it to say, for instance, how much do you use? So of all the research that you do, I know it's quite possible to go down a rabbit hole and just find the most fascinating things that you can't possibly use because they're irrelevant to your novel, but and without, you know, wanting to risk an info dump. So how do you sort of sieve the information that you've gathered and use it?
Well, I don't do very much research at all, because when you're 75, you have a huge amount of experience, and all of my experience has been in the area about which I am writing. So it's only things like needing to know about bats, because I've never had any occasion in my life to become interested in bats, that I just go to Mr. Google and I just find as little as I have to and do that. Basically, I'm not really into research. So I think, well, if I don't know it, I can write about something else. That sounds very arrogant, but I mean, in a long life, you pick up so many little things that you think are never going to be used, and it's just a sentence here and a paragraph there, and it's just amazing. I mean, when you think of all the things that you have done through your life, you can sooner or later work all or most of them into your writing.
Yeah, so, well, that's the whole write what you know. I mean, you know, that's a bit of a misnomer for writers out there saying write what you know. Because if I wrote what I knew without any research, my books would be exceptionally boring. So I don't think it's arrogant of you at all, Kerry, to say that, you know, in your life, and I know from having seen you interviewed before, just what that life of yours has entailed, the sorts of jobs you've had and the places you lived. Obviously, you know, the facts and the knowledge just oozes out of you, and you don't need to do much research except if you want something unique like bats. Because I can honestly say that I assume that you would have done quite a good deal of of research on the specific things like the vegetation and all of that sort of stuff. So if you know all that, then brava to you, because that's just fabulous.
Well, when we were started as kids in the bush, my father made us learn the name and the use of every piece of timber that grew. So you don't do things like that. So I can go anywhere in the north and tell you what sort of tree it is and what it's good for, whether it's firewood, whether it's makes a post, whether it makes a rail, whether it makes a shade, and that sort of thing you don't forget. And I remember when I was doing Heartwood Hotel, I decided to give them bees. This is another source of income, to keep bees. Well, that's no problem, because I kept bees myself. So it's little things like that, you know. You never think you're going to use them, but you do.
Yeah, that's fabulous. I just love that. What about you, Katherine? Did you have to sort of filter out some of the fabulous stuff that you learned, or have you got a notebook full of things to use for the next book?
Yeah, I do. I certainly do have ideas kind of feel like they're just flooding my head. And again, I've covered so many different cases. It does feel like almost information overload. But I really liked what Kerry said about when she needs to look something up, she only looks up as much as she needs to know. Because I think that is a bit of a trap you can fall into. You know, I certainly did, and I'm sure lots of people who are just starting out can fall into that trap where you feel like you need to know everything to prove that this character's an expert in whatever. You really don't, for one. And secondly, you can end up just overwhelming your reader in a boring way with just
the info dump.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can also use it as a bit of a sort of procrastination technique for yourself as far as actually just getting the work done. Instead, you go down this rabbit hole of trying to research everything. My tip would be only research what you need as you go. So really, you know, even now as I'm writing, as much as I've got all the information from cases, if I come across something specific I need, like Kerry was saying, bats or, you know, a car or something I don't know much about, I will only give myself 10 to 15 minutes, whatever I can find. That's what we're going with, and I keep moving. Otherwise,
you're so fabulous. I go down that rabbit hole for days on end.
You end up just researching, and 3 weeks has gone by and your book has not progressed at all, but you're an expert on, you know, VW Beetles or something.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't really assist you.
Yeah, another tip, because I have a tendency to go down rabbit holes. One thing that I do is I try and write if I need a particular sort of weapon, for instance, and it is important of what kind it is. Then I just put I'm writing, then I put gun, and then I just, you know, and an asterisk next to it, and then later on I go looking for the asterisk and go, oh right, okay, I'll need to find out what sort of gun that is, or what kind of car it is, or, you know, how much blood will be lost from that body if it's stabbed to death in that way, that sort of stuff. So, but that's one piece of advice for anyone researching. If you want to avoid the rabbit hole, is write the book without those details, and go back and search for the things that you don't know. Clearly, Kerry only needed to go back or go forward and look at bats, which I think is just fabulous. Okay, we're nearly out of time, but we've got one last question from Marion. Marion wants to know, how is your cover chosen, and do you agree with how the final product looks? How closely does it reflect your impression of what your book is really about? So just so can we see, this is Kerry's book, Croc Country. So Kerry, are you happy with the cover? Is it what you imagined? Is it?
Well, I never imagine the covers because I know it's the publisher's job, but I was very happy with that one because it's very indicative of the rangy Gulf country.
Yeah.
One of my other books, they had, it was in the desert, and they had, I'm trying to think what it was, the Roadhouse, and the cover originally came out with blue mountains, well, ranges. And I said,
yes.
Not possible. There is no blue mountains growing. You're thinking of the Blue Mountains, you know.
Exactly.
They changed it to ochre, so which was really good. So, I mean, they welcome your input at Penguin, but I don't expect to design the cover myself. I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
They do a great job, really.
I think usually you can say, you get the chance to say no, absolutely not, because that is impossible for my book. But but that's about all. So this is Katherine's cover. What did you think? Were you happy with it, Katherine?
Yeah, I was, but I had absolutely no say in it. I wasn't even given options. I was just told, and here's your cover. So I kind of just went with it. And to be honest, I haven't thought too much about it. In fact, they chose the title as well of my book. They chose the title and the cover. And I have to say, being completely new and not knowing better, I don't want to presume that I know better. So I pretty much just went, whatever you tell me, I trust you, you know, and I went with it. So I had no images in my head. I didn't even have an idea for the title. I just let them take over and I sort of trusted them. I have a really great relationship with Bev at Penguin, my publisher. So pretty much if she says to me she likes it, I go, okay, great. And I don't worry about those details because they're sort of beyond me. You know, I'm not a designer. I'm not artistic. I'm useless at drawing. So I can't even sort of picture what I want it to be. Just focus on the writing and let all that kind of take care of itself.
Yeah. And also, of course, because your name's on the front, if that's assuming that it is your name and they didn't change that as well. So you don't really care. Your name's on the front and it's been published. So I've just got a bit of housekeeping to finish up with. And so I'll thank you both very much for your time and your fabulous answers tonight and your fabulous books. And I will tell all of the people who are watching, please go out and get hold of Croc Country and Sticks and Stones. If you haven't already done it, borrow it from the library. I believe that that's still possible despite our current tedious situation. So I have it on good authority that both books are available in hard copy and digital format from Geelong Library. But the libraries instituted launched a click and deliver home delivery service. That's if you live in Geelong. If you're tuned into this from elsewhere, tough, because I don't think they'll be delivering to you. The books are, of course, available at all good bookstores as well, if you choose to buy. And just as a word of whatever to people out there, don't ever feel guilty about borrowing an author's book from a library, because we authors get such a thing called public lending rights. We are reimbursed for all of the books that are out there in libraries. So the more that there are in libraries, the better for us. So don't ever feel like we're being stiff in any way by you borrowing from the libraries. Do not feel guilty. Please support your libraries because they are one of the best institutions in the country. So I think I better check my list of things just to make sure. I think that's all. So once again, thank you so much, Kerry, up there in Bundaberg, for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It has been a real pleasure.
And thank you, Katherine, from lockdown in Melbourne. And I'm thanking you both from the Mornington Peninsula, where I'm lurking. And thank you to everyone who came along, who asked questions. Thank you to the Geelong Library for hosting us this evening. And good night. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.